Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be part 21, chapter 21. Shota's not sure he's ever moved as fast as he is now. His heart thrums in his chest and his legs and arms pulse achingly in overexertion. He's been running for a while now, traversing over rooftops in a flurry of pounding footsteps and sharp, purposeful wisps of his capture weapon. He has one goal in mind, and that goal is getting to where his problem child, the kid who'd weaseled his way into his Shota's life, the child he'd taken on as a foster, had pinned his location with nothing but an explanation. It's a cry for help, a panicked plea, desperation. He wonders who else got the hurried message, so hurried, in fact, that Izuku hadn't bothered, or had time, that thought in which makes Shota's heart freeze up, to add any additional information. He knows himself and Hizashi had gotten the message, but was there anyone else? And it makes Shota's heart seize in his chest because he's not there. He's not there to help. The man forces out a ragged breath, lungs burning in his chest. His lungs feel dry, as does his throat, but he's not sure if it's the fear or the fact that he's pushing himself harder and past his usual breaking point. Patrol, as strange as it is to say, isn't typically as grueling as this. His routes are routine, and his body almost moves on autopilot down the handful of patrol districts that he gets placed on throughout the week. He has 4 distinct routes, and there's no pattern to which he goes and when, but patterns are bad, especially when you don't know who's watching and learning them. This is overtaxing in a way that he hadn't felt in years, but he keeps going. 2 of his kids are in the heart of the danger zone. 2. Ida he can see, and Manuel patrols Hosu, and he obviously would have gone to help out when the chaos struck. Tenya in tow, but Izuku? Izuku isn't even supposed to be in Hosu, and he's certainly not supposed to be in what looks like a hidden alley only seen in the finest print of a map pin. Honestly, if there wasn't a literal pin in the street name, Shota isn't sure he'd be able to locate it. The street is small and mazed off by other small streets, a decent way away from the main street. What the hell is his kid doing there? His thoughts are tripping over his problem child on repeat, the fact that he was in the city when he wasn't supposed to be, and that he had sent a terrifying message, then answered none of the questioning texts or dozens of calls that Hizashi attempted. He can focus on the nitty-gritty details later. At this point, he just needs to get there. The train had been down. A train car headed to Shinjuku had been attacked by the Nomus as it was passing through Hosu. The train car had been totaled, and the last he'd heard, they'd still been working to evacuate the civilians that were trapped aboard, as well as getting the pro who'd been attacked medical attention. That had been a wrench in Shota's plan of making it to his kids, students, he means, as fast as he could. The train from Musutafu to Hosu is roughly 25 minutes, depending on if there's any delays or problems. It's the fastest way to travel from city to city, considering there isn't much traffic like when driving, and it was much faster than walking or even running. But when the busted train car in Hosu was blocking the rails and the attack was currently going on, nothing was moving. Shota had almost punched a wall when he was stopped and informed of the station closure by station staff not allowing anyone in. Honestly, he probably should have suspected it would be down. Public transportation stops when there's a threat nearby. And even if he hadn't been aware of the train car attack, he was aware of the Nomus and the League of Villains running amok in Hosu. Of course they'd shut down transportation to the city. Under this attack, the city wouldn't risk potential casualties and additional damage. So, with that, Shota had done the next best thing. He'd shot the station worker a vicious snarl before clambering up on top of the wall of the station. His best bet at this point was getting himself there on his own 2 feet, and he was much faster up high than he was down on the ground, and with his capture weapon there to swing and catch himself with, it just made it that much faster. Traffic would be clogged, he knew. Even if he were to take the car, the roads wouldn't be any clearer than the train tracks probably were when it came to panicked civilians rushing out of the area under attack. The roads would be a mess with the evacuations. So, this was his best option, pushing himself to full ability, pushing past the strain he's already feeling. He made good time, considering. He'd subconsciously given himself a limit of 1 hour to make it to his problem child. It was a logical aim, doubling the time it takes to arrive on train and adding the additional 10 minutes of leeway. He made it to the outskirts of Hosu in just under 35 minutes, and was fast approaching Izuku's pinned location when he heard the 45-minute mark hit. He stumbled to an ungraceful stop at the edge of a building that peered down at the location pin, heart dropping to his stomach when he realizes that no, Izuku wasn't here anymore. The alley is empty, hardly even looking like a fight had taken place below. What could have happened in the hour since Shota had received that text? A lot, that was the answer. Anything can happen in a matter of seconds, especially in such a dangerous job. An hour was vast. Literally anything could have happened since Izuku pressed that send button. And now he's gone. Takes just a second to take in a draw, shaky breath. His lungs ache and his limbs are on the cusp of growing numb. The oxygen is welcome, but it grates at his raw, dry throat and heaving lungs. He sucks in a second breath, and that's when he hears it. Ida's voice. He's moving before he even realizes it. Ida was close. Maybe Ida had come to Izuku's aid. Will he find his #1 problem child in the hands of the respected class rep? He fucking hopes so. His body is hit unexpectedly with a burst of adrenaline, now that he's suddenly so close to his kid, or he hopes that he's close to Izuku at least. In the least, he's close to Tenya. He can check in with him, maybe get a peace of mind. The encroaching numbness is wiped away for the time being, and his lungs, though rough and feeling as if they're on fire, don't ache. The edge of the building just before the main road is in sight, and he's so close. The voices are louder now, more of them. Ida and Todoroki. Todoroki? What the hell is Todoroki doing here, too? There are 3 of his kids here. 3 of them, when only one is supposed to technically be in Hosu as Ida. He should have expected Endeavor to come aid with the mayhem as well, though. It's good publicity, sure, but seriously, what kind of moron takes a 15-year-old into the eye of a villain storm? Sure, he's on internship, but Todoroki has only been a Yuuei student for a couple months, not to mention the fact that he doesn't have a provisional license yet. It's still illegal for the students to use their quirks. This is nothing more than a learning internship at this point, working with the small, petty criminals one tends to encounter on patrol, not diving headfirst into a full-on battle. It's to see what the world of heroes and villains well and truly is, so these kids aren't hanging on to false hope. It's not to toss them into something that they're not ready for. It's even if they think they are. They aren't. Fuck, he really should have seen this coming. His class of Hellions. At this point, he should expect for the other 17 students to just appear before the night's over as well. Shota rushes to the edge of the building, only to stiffen. There's shouting, desperate shouting. He wants to look down and see what the yelling is about, but his eyes are locked on something else. A Nomu. A flying one. A flying Nomu clutching someone in his talons. Shota sees a head of fluffy, forest green hair in that oh-so-familiar hero costume. He sees red. Blood collecting on the teen, soaking into his costume in dark patches. His teen. His kid. That thing has his kid. There's yelling and shouting, but it all falls on muted ears. Shota can just hear his own heart pumping in his ears, eyes staring in what feels like slow motion as that thing carries his kid away. He has to physically pull himself out of his fearful daze, clutching desperately at his capture weapon and rearing back to hope that the bastard holding his kid, but before he can, something else, someone else, is launching onto the Nomu and then Izuku, whoever that is, and the Nomu are all tumbling to the ground. He's broken out of the trance-like state that he'd been in at seeing the boy he'd taken in and somehow gotten attached to hit the ground. They weren't high up, but it was still a drop. Shota leaps down from the top of the building with little regard for his own safety. He barely managed to catch his capture weapon on a lamppost to ease the impact of hitting the ground, but he's too focused on Izuku. No one moves. Izuku's on the ground behind the... Who even is that? No hero Shota had ever seen before. Not even an underground one as far as he knows. Todoroki and Ida are crowded in, with a few pro-heroes who Shota does not know vaguely, but no one makes any move to get to his kid. Not even his students. For a second, anger thrums in his veins before he sees the fear twisted into his kid's expressions. They're intently watching that one pro, the one who'd taken out the Nomu. He hardly hears the chatter coming from the pros. They're surprised that the stranger had saved Izuku. Surprise is not good coming from pros. They obviously know something that Shota doesn't. The thought prickles his skin. He sees Endeavor's flames out of the corner of his eye, where he's remaining still like the others, afraid to provoke whatever is happening here. Izuku is all right for the most part. The Nomu is dead, and that man, the pro, had saved him, not harmed him. Breathy conversation filters around him, but he's too intently focused on his students to really hear. He doesn't think any of them have noticed him, not with whatever was happening here. Some threat that Shota doesn't quite understand until 2 words. Shota's overactive brain manages to catch on to just 2 of Endeavor's words. Just 2. Hero killer. And that is not a pro. That is Not a pro standing in front of his kid, keeping his kid from aid, from help. Izuku hasn't gotten up. He's probably bleeding. Shota knows he's bleeding, and he could be concussed or injured more than the eye can see, but it's worrying that he's making zero effort to force himself up. That's the fucking hero killer, the murderer who'd taken out dozens of skilled pro heroes, who'd single-handedly ended Tensei's career as a pro, leaving him within an inch of his life. And now the bastard had Izuku. Of course, it would be his group of dumbass students to find the hero killer. Stain, damn it. Was the attack on Hosu not enough? They needed to attract the attention of the current most wanted serial killer, like the danger magnets they are too? The hero killer, despite being on the news near constantly, had never really been given a clear appearance besides police sketches that varied with each new victim's description of him, but when it comes to sketch descriptions from traumatized victims or civilians who encounter him, it's not always accurate. Details get lost in time, and very few actually get a good look at their assailant. The more Shota looks now, though, the more he realizes that this man does vaguely resemble the sketches he'd seen in the station and broadcasted over the news outlets. Fuck. He needs to get Izuku away from him. Sure, he'd saved Izuku from the Nomu just now, but who's to say Stain doesn't turn and take Izuku out the same way he'd taken out the Nomu? Izuku is a heroic student, after all. He's learning to be a hero. A lot happens in a matter of a couple seconds. Just Endeavor's appearance enrages the hero killer. Stain is on his feet, Izuku thankfully forgotten, as the gathering of pros is also forgotten that are circling around his two other students. The killer's attention is on Endeavor, solely. Shota doesn't know what makes Stain stop, the killer's body freezing and cutting off his words, the bitter preaching and slander of the hero world. His jaw goes slack and his eyes glaze over. Shota doesn't have a second to be worried about him, though, because Todoroki and Ida are rushing to Izuku, and the pros are split, half circling the hero killer cautiously, while the other half take off after his students. Endeavor is making his way to the hero killer as well, seemingly ignoring the fact that his child was clearly panicked in his own way. God, Shota hates limelight heroes. All that mattered to them was being the one to make the arrest, and looking good doing it. Shota made his way over to Izuku, momentarily reveling in the guilt and fear clouded in Tenya's eyes. Good. The brat should be afraid. Tenya had spotted him first when he'd pushed his way through the group of pros, making no move to really help. It's only Ida and Todoroki who fall to their knees beside Izuku's prone form. Ida hovers his hands a bit uselessly, while Todoroki presses his hand, his left, the warm one, to Izuku's neck before pulling the green-haired teen into his side completely, taking great care to keep his right side away from him. What? Sensei. Todoroki is the one to speak, one eyebrow arcing, faintly in surprise when he finally catches sight of his teacher. What are you doing here? Eraserhead, Shota corrects gruffly as he pushes through the pros standing idly by. Irritation settles in Shota's blood at the ogling. How are they just standing around while Izuku's tended to by kids? He drops to his knees beside Ida, surveying over Izuku's limp body tucked into Todoroki's side. What does it look like I'm doing? Now, what the hell happened here? We fought the hero killer. Todoroki supplies easily, tone indifferent, like he hadn't just taken on a serial killer with two classmates and then watched his classmate be lifted away by one of the same creatures to attack the USJ and put Shota out of commission for a while. Ida looks away guilty, not speaking, and Shota knows that this wasn't just the three of us accidentally met up and also accidentally stumbled upon Stain and decided to fight him kind of thing. They'll touch up on that later, when he's not staring down at an unconscious Izuku and crowded by his injured students. He's got questions, like, how did his students stumble upon the current most wanted serial killer? How did his students make it out of that fight with their lives? Why the hell are Izuku and Todoroki even here right now? Why weren't any of them with their internship mentors? But those can all wait until his head has cleared a little and his students are treated. They will have words, though. You shouldn't move him. Shota shakes his head, glaring lightly at where Todoroki is curled around Izuku. Izuku shouldn't have been touched until the paramedics arrived. They clearly need to spend more time on rescue techniques. If the person in question is out of immediate danger, it's best to leave them until medical professional can assess the damage before potentially worsening it by carelessly moving them around, especially when they're unconscious. He's freezing, the dual-haired teen mutters, remaining completely still as to not jostle Izuku. My fireside helps. Shota blinks in surprise, a frown settling on his lips as he leans forward to touch at Izuku's exposed hand. Todoroki's right. Izuku's skin is cold to the touch. He's not conscious worryingly, but Shota can hear the whir of sirens approaching. Hopefully they'll arrive soon and he'll be able to get his kid some help. None look particularly good. They're all in need of medical attention. It's not really cold out, no more than it usually is this time of year, but still Izuku is ice cold. He remembers Chiyo warning them of Izuku's below-average temperature, but this was much worse than the cautious warning implied. Izuku was at risk of hypothermia at this point. Hypothermia that virtually had no cause. Why was his body so cold? All right. Shota gives a little nod. He can't say he's thrilled to relinquish control of Izuku's well-being to a student, but if the kid really is in the early stages of hypothermia, keeping him close to Todoroki's fireside is the most logical option here. Keep him warm, then. EMTs are en route. I passed them on my way. If he has hypothermia, then he has a risk of his body shutting down. Monitor him, and if his temperature drops any more, or you have any concerns, tell me right away. We don't know the extent of his injuries, so try not to jostle him. Try not to let his temperature drop much more, but don't overheat him either. I trust you can regulate your temperature, especially your fireside after the festival. Okay, Todoroki gives a light nod. And I can, Eraserhead. Good. Shota lets out a soft breath despite the gravelly reply. His attention jumps from Izuku and Todoroki and on to Tenya. He has a lot of questions for the teen, like why in the hell he thought it was a good idea to try and take on the hero killer, who paralyzed his older brother, and that's a question for behind closed doors, and preferably when the scarier of the two of them, Hizashi, is there to talk some sense into their pseudo-nephew. Instead, he takes another calming breath and turns towards the sound of the sirens gradually gaining in volume. Pros block his view. An annoyance settles in his stomach. Don't just stand there and ogle, he snaps, the cluster of pros watching them. Flag down the ambulances, restrain that Nomu, assist with Stain. He barks the orders out, and even though none of these pros know him, he could be a random civilian for all they know. They jump into action at the harshness of his tone and the suggestion of actions that they shouldn't need to hear. He doesn't know if it's the Nomu or Stain are actually really dead or just heavily injured, but the pros just watching his students pissing him off. And besides, either way, Nomu shouldn't be underestimated. They're known to regenerate, and that man, injured or not, is notorious as a serial killer, also not to be underestimated. The pros scatter like bugs, leaving just Shota, his students, and a small elderly man with a yellow hero costume. The costume is familiar, but the face isn't. It takes probably a second too long for his scattered thoughts to settle on the fact that this was Gran Torino, just a lot older than his license ID photo from years and years ago. Gran Torino. Shota greets dully, shooting one last look to his students trying to keep themselves calm despite Midoriya's condition, before he pushes himself up and steps up to the shorter man. He hopes there's enough distance that none of the students will hear, but he's not about to walk off to chat and leave them in this state. You must be the boys' homeroom teacher, then. The short man eyes him up and down. Eraserhead, right? We spoke briefly through email, a little unusual. I got in contact with all the sketchy pro heroes offering my students internships. Shota drawls, knowing that he should probably be watching his mouth, but at the same time his students are hurt. There's a serial killer on the ground. There's a Nomu on the ground. He's tired, he's exhausted, and he's on his last nerve. His filter at this point is just gone. Teaching one single year at Yuuei and then disappearing off the face of the earth after retirement, only to return and offer a 15-year-old an internship randomly? Bit strange, wouldn't you agree? Gran Torino's observing expression doesn't flicker at all despite Shota's words. Gran Torino's eyes narrow and he leans a bit on his cane. Did the boy get many offers after his performance in the festival? Powerful quirk, but poor control. One could argue that he put minimum effort into harnessing his ability, damaged his body to the point that he needed a medical bot to escort him to the infirmary. Seems like he'd be a bit of a liability in the field. The retired pro gestures to the students, and Shota has to bite his tongue before he says something he regrets. He doesn't like the implication that Izuku's quirk was the cause of this. He doesn't know what happened, why he's in a poor condition like he is, but if it was his quirk's superpower, he'd have broken limbs, not hyperthermia. Shota simply glares instead of replying. He knows if he opens his mouth now, he won't be able to stop. Hizashi has said that he doesn't have a very nice mouth when he's furious, and he can feel his irritation ticking up. He's not sure if this anger comes from a teacher standpoint or a guardian standpoint, but he knows either way he's pissed. The elderly man sighs, shifts where he's standing, and adjusts his hands on the cane. You're right to be suspicious. I had no interest in taking on an intern in many years, but I knew I could teach the boys some important stuff throughout the internship. Shota raises an eyebrow, a silent inquiry about what had happened to be teaching his student. Gran Torino eyes him thoughtfully. Shota's not sure what the small man finds, but his shoulders relax slightly and he rubs at his chin as he continues. Anyone can see the boy has potential to be a great hero, but no one's willing to take the risk of his quirk. I am. I worked with people who've had similar quirks, taught children just like him. Shota's quiet, listening to the man intently. That quirk of his is powerful, and it will continue to cause him harm until he figures out how to use it right. And you are familiar with his quirk? Shota narrows his eyes, shoulders slouching as he crosses his arms across his chest. Specifically his quirk. Why? How? Looking at Midoriya is like looking at my student from years ago, Gran Torino shrugs. The similarities are uncanny, from their drives to their attitudes to their quirks. If I taught one, I can teach another. I don't want to see another powerful quirk ruin a young man's life. The retired pro huffs out a low breath, scratching at his chin before dropping his hand back onto his cane. Quirks, like that, have the potential to be something great, or they have the potential to tear you to shreds. Midoriya already has a permanent damage to his arm. Hopefully, with what he learned from me, he can handle the quirk, and the way he handles it has gotten better. And you're that confident? Shota cocks an eyebrow. I told you, I've dealt with the quirk almost exactly the same. Shota has more questions, but he doesn't get the chance to ask. The ambulances are pulling up, and the sirens are blaring loud, enough to give him a headache, and he needs to be with his kids. I trust you'll take care of my intern. The man arches an eyebrow, and Shota wants to growl. I have business to attend to, but I'll check in with him at the hospital. Shota decides not to reply, and instead turns to where 3 ambulances had arrived. The first is seeing to Stain, who is apparently still alive. The second trying to pry Izuku away from Todoroki. The underground hero takes a quick step in their direction. Shota manages to convince the EMT pair that's working on Izuku to let Todoroki ride along. The stretcher's big enough for the two of them to sit comfortably together, especially with the fact that Izuku's pressed close against Todoroki's fireside for warmth. They're all going to the same place anyways, and with the commotion still dying out downtown, ambulances will be hard to get at this point. The EMTs hardly put up a fight after they realize Todoroki's doing a better job at keeping Izuku warm than any of their equipment will. Shota isn't sure he likes the worry etched on their faces when they take Izuku's temperature, but he's sure that he'll get a full report as soon as he can from a doctor at the hospital. He watches as they help Todoroki onto the stretcher, who in turn helps Izuku on. Shota turns away from them to catch Tenya's gaze. He raises an eyebrow in question when he notices the teenagers watching them uncertainly. Guilt, with an edge of fear, flickers through the boy's eyes, hardly hidden behind his glasses. He's known Tenya since he was 1 year old, maybe 2. He's not entirely sure at which point their friendship with Tensei had blossomed enough to go to his house after school, where they'd met baby Tenya and the rest of the Ida family. You should go with Midoriya and Todoroki, Eraserhead. Tenya clears his throat. I see Manuel making his way through the crowd now, so I won't be alone, and I'm sure he'll have quite a lot to say about this. True to his words, Manuel calls out Ida's name, waving to attract attention. It's logical, but Shota thinks the kid just doesn't want to be alone with him, and it's probably a good call. And he's not the only one with quite a lot to say. Shota scoffs easily, glaring over his nose at the teen who shrinks into himself a little at Shota's hard tone. He pauses, glancing back at where the ambulance is holding Izuku and Todoroki, and they're getting ready to take off before looking back at Tenya. You sure you'll be all right? Despite his annoyance at the world in general, and his nagging worry, Shota makes sure to soften his voice in regards to Tenya, studying the teen's face for any micro-expressions that may contradict his words. He doesn't spot anything, honestly. Of course, Tenya puffs out his chest. You should be focused on Midoriya's well-being. I'm worried about his temperature drop considering it's spring, almost summer now. Midoriya should be your top priority since he's the one that's in the most worrying state. You're all my priority, Shota huffs, letting his tense shoulders relax just the slightest bit. If you're sure, though, stick with Manuel until I find you in the hospital. Got it? Of course. Tenya bows his head, hand reaching up to clutch at his shoulder, as an EMT finally rushes towards him when they spot the blood. Please, take care of my friends, Eraserhead. They're only in these states because of me. I will, kid, Shota says, ignoring the second half of the teen's words for the time being. He pats at Ida's uninjured shoulder, giving a light squeeze before he's ushering the teen towards the waiting EMTs. He waves to Manuel before falling back to where Todoroki and Izuku are now fully loaded, climbing into the ambulance and silently daring the medic to tell him he can't ride with them. The medic says nothing, does nothing, past the hesitantly cocked eyebrow, and Shota almost comments and commands him for valuing his life, not trying to provoke an anxious, angry, and severely overtired bear. Some people in this world still have common sense, at least. The door slams shut with everyone tucked inside, and Shota can't help but slump back against the wall of the truck as he watches the single medic treat Izuku to the best of his ability, working around Todoroki, who blatantly refuses treatment until Izuku's cared for, and pretending to not see Shota's intimidating glare as the pro watches with a hawk's eye. Class 1A this year is going to be the death of him. He can see it now. As expected, when they arrive at the hospital, his students are taken away by clusters of nurses and doctors. The hospital's very busy. The attack has left dozens of civilians and heroes alike injured and in need of medical attention. The emergency room is packed in, varying degrees of injuries, but none life-threatening. A small part of Shota is immensely glad that his students arrived via ambulance, which meant that they were top of the priority to be treated. That meant they didn't have to deal with the overpacked emergency room. Not that Izuku wouldn't have been skyrocketed to the top of the waiting list with his drop temperature and unconscious state anyway, but even then, if they had been added to a waiting list, Shota would have rained down hell until his kids got the attention they need. They may have been acting against orders, acting on their own. He didn't want to say stupid, but stupid accounts. But they'd done what the police and countless pros couldn't, and that was catching the hero killer. Maybe at some point down the line he'll be proud of what they'd done, and possibly even praise them, but right now is not that point. He's not sure it'll be that point for quite a while, but maybe it'll happen sometime. Maybe. After Todoroki and Izuku are wheeled out of sight, leaving Shota stood in the ambulance at Terminal alone. The underground hero refused to move until that second ambulance with Tenya and Manuel arrived. Stain would be taken to a guarded hospital, suited to handle villains, so he didn't have to worry about the killer being in the same building as his students. It didn't take too long for Ida's ambulance to arrive, and he was quickly wheeled off in the same direction that they'd taken Todoroki and Izuku. Tenya had barely been able to sit up and look at his teacher before he was gone from sight. Manuel hesitated by Shota's side when it was just the two of them. Shota doesn't really look over, but already tired of the interaction. Something about Gran Torino had rubbed him the wrong way, and he's not sure why. He has nothing against Manuel. He just reached his people quota for the whole month, and knows despite that he'll need to keep pushing. Shota only looks over when Manuel shifts, much like his students do when they're nervous. I should go give my statement. The pro frowned, staring at the doors, where the engine quirk teen had just disappeared through. Will you stay with him? He told me that you're his homeroom sensei, and I know he trusts you. He talks highly of you, Eraserhead. Yeah, Shota gives a disinterested sniff. No one needs to know that he has any connection to these kids, past teacher and student. They don't need to know that he's known Tenya since he was in diapers, or that Midoriya is currently his ward. Information like that getting out is dangerous, so it's best to keep up a front. Though the single word comes out stiff, it's nothing but honesty. Deep down he knows that he'd never leave his students in their current states. Currently, he's as close to a guardian as they have, and with the Yuuei contracts all the parents and guardians signed at the beginning of the year, he has the faintest bit of legal say over them, so it should come to any life or death situations and their guardians aren't around or can't be reached. He has some pull. The truth was that if he did leave for whatever reason, it would be against his will, and he would have had to have been dragged away, kicking and screaming. He wouldn't willingly leave his brats, students, alone in a hospital without someone they know, unless he had to. Even if they are training to be heroes, they're still allowed to be scared. They are still children. He doesn't mention that to Manuel, though. It shouldn't take long. Manuel rubs nervously at the back of his neck. Shota eyes him with a blank expression that's nothing but exhaustion, but probably comes off as unfriendly to an untrained eye. I'd just like to check up on him when he's settled in a room. We talked a little bit on the way over, but I still have some questions. I didn't want to say too much with civilians around or overwhelm him so soon after that fight. I mean, wow, the hero killer. It truly is a harrowing thought. The killer stumping the police and taking heroes out left and right, stopped and apprehended by 3 first-year students. If that doesn't tell Shota he's in for a long year, he doesn't know what will. He keeps the uneasy sigh threatening to fall from his lungs to himself. Understandable. Shota bows his head in a nod. I also have questions for them. I won't be leaving, so you feel free. It would be illogical for me to leave any of my students alone, so I'll stay until their respective guardians arrive. Not to mention that he was one of those guardians. Right. Manuel shoots him a tiny smile before he's stepping away. Thank you. Shota bows his head a second time in acknowledgement, watching the blue-clad pro disappear down a hallway with signs labeling exit. Shota lingers for a second longer before turning on his heels and stalking tiredly down the opposite hallway in an attempt to find the waiting room. He passes the reception desk on his way to the waiting room, informing the receptionist that he's an emergency medical proxy for all 3 of his students until their guardians arrive, and that he'd like to be informed when they're settled in a room. He also gives them the information they need to get in contact with the students' guardians before they finally are finding the way to the waiting room and collapsing into one of the hard, uncomfortable chairs. His eyes are begging to be closed, and his brain wants to shut off and sleep for a bit, but he forces himself to stay up. He busies himself with his phone, fiddling with the device he hadn't touched since his draining and emotional call with Hisashi earlier. The text from Izuku had come in around 11 p.m., meaning that Shota had arrived on scene just shortly after 12. Hisashi would have just been getting ready for bed after a long day, early morning patrol, teaching, followed by his prep at the radio station for his show. Shota can only imagine how exhausted Hisashi is going to be when he arrives. He tried to talk him into sleeping for a while before making the trip to Hosu over the phone, at least when he'd calmed down enough that he wasn't in complete hysterics, but Hisashi hadn't even considered it, despite the curl of exhaustion in his tone. Shota had pleaded that even just a short catnap would have done some good for him, but his husband had been too worried about their foster kid to even lie down. His husband had downright refused, actually, and that was accompanied by the jingling of car keys and the apartment door locking behind him. Shota had wanted to be exasperated at Hisashi's antics, but then again, when he'd taken that call, he himself had been sprinting and leaping from rooftop to rooftop. He knew Hisashi was just as antsy as he was to get to Izuku. He'd been in hysterics when he'd called Shota, rushing around the apartment and getting ready to leave. Shota's just glad that Hisashi listened to logic instead of his protective heart. They'd arranged for the blonde to bring the car and fight against traffic while Shota made his way to the kids in a timely manner as he could. Hisashi and his quirk weren't suited for fast travel like Shota could with his capture weapons, so it was best for him to take that extra time and get here safely. And with the car so they wouldn't have to taxi home when the kids, Izuku, were discharged. Shota slumps in his chair as he finally unlocks his phone, skipping past the overflowing notifications marring his lock screen. He knows exactly who'd been blowing up his phone and for what reason, and discreetly opens up his text logs with Hisashi. Did you find him? I'm stuck in traffic. Hardly moving. Show? I'm going to assume you found him. If not, you're not answering me. Is he okay? He's okay, right? Shota, please tell me he's okay. Okay, I'm moving again. Text soon. Love you. He's glad to see Hisashi had managed to calm himself enough to text correct grammar for the most part, at least, which means that his husband is also coherent enough to be a responsible driver as well. Shota knows sitting in quiet and just thinking helps Hisashi process things, which is why his husband tends to take his hearing aids out, at least when he's overwhelmed. Being alone in a car, stuck in traffic, is basically the same thing. There's a brief period of no text, so Shota assumes traffic had moved and Hisashi was focused on the road. I found them, at Hosu General right now. No word yet. Hisashi's text comes fast enough that Shota has to refrain from letting out a tired snort of amusement. The urge is overpowered by a frown as he thinks about his students and where he's sitting right now. Thank God! He's okay, yeah? Tell me he's okay. Can I talk to him? Wait, them? Shota, what the fuck? Who else is there? Shota takes a second to try and figure out how to ease his husband into this. No, sorry, you can't talk to him. He's unconscious, was somehow cold enough that it'd be a surprise if he didn't have hypothermia, and is probably getting stitches because a flying fucking Nomu made an attempt at grabbing him and soaring off. He was only saved by the hero killer, who 3 of my idiot first-year heroic students, our foster child amongst them, decided to try their hand at taking him out. They did it, but they got beat to shit in the process. Just the thought of unloading all of that onto Hisashi makes Shota grimace, especially the thought of doing it over text. I don't know the details. They were a little shaken up by it all. Izuku's not conscious when I got to him, but I'd rather tell you the details in person. I think most of this is better told in person, honestly. Everyone else is okay, but I'm not giving you more to overthink about when you're driving. I don't want you to worry while you're driving as well. Please be safe. A little late for that, Sho. My current state is worry. Has been since Zuku sent that text. I am driving safe, I mean. Stuck in traffic again, because the universe says fuck you. Nothing is moving. I want to bang my head on the wheel. Wait, what do you mean unconscious? You'll be okay, right? I'm sure he'll be fine. It's Izuku. He's tough. Shota leans back in his chair, biting at his bottom lip. He glares down at his phone. Studying his own text, it feels like the words stare back at him, almost taunting. Will the kid be all right? Shota's been a hero for a lot of years, and he's never felt someone's hands be so cold to the touch before. Someone who wasn't dead, at least. The comparison of that is unsettling and leaves a bitter, vile taste in his mouth. The dark-haired man squeezes his eyes shut as he forces out a calming breath through his lips that are pressed into a straight line, as to not let himself get worked up. He can't. Not now. Not when he has kids depending on him. He'll be okay. He's not sure if he's trying to convince himself or Hisashi with that last text, but he really tries to make himself believe it as he stares down at the words. His head falls back against the wall, the thump echoing softly around the nearly vacant room. There's 2 other people waiting, but for what he's not sure. Neither of them look in his direction at the noise, and he's grateful. Shota settles his phone face down against his thigh, hand covering the back of it as he draws in even, supposedly calming breaths. It doesn't help much. It feels more like a hassle than it does calming. He doesn't look at his phone until it vibrates against his thigh, once, then twice. He takes one more breath before flipping it and looking at the notification on the lock screen. About to move. Be there soon. Hang in there, all right? Love you. Shota thinks about sending a text back, maybe returning the soft words, but decides against it. If Hisashi's moving again, he doesn't want to distract him. Last thing he needs is to be visiting both his problem child, foster son, and his problem adult husband in the hospital. He lets his phone fall back against his thigh and blows out another slow breath. Now he waits. Izuku isn't quite sure where he is. He doesn't feel anything, not pain or numbness. He doesn't quite feel right exactly, but it's not a bad feeling. It's like he's floating. The anti-gravity feeling like when Uraraka uses her quirk on you, but he's not moving. He's not doing anything. He doesn't quite remember what happened. Something did. Something big happened. He thinks he should remember it, but he can't. Tries really hard to think back to what happened, but he comes up short. Why does everything feel so fuzzy? It's not just his limbs and body feeling numb, it's his brain and memories as well. He doesn't know where he is, but something about it feels familiar, in a foreign, never been there but know of it kind of way. It's dark, like a void of some sort, empty and consuming, not really anything of Earth besides maybe 13's quirk black hole, but he's fairly positive he's not trapped in 13's black hole quirk. He would feel more pain if he was. He'd seen what the quirk had done to 13 when it had been used against her in the USJ. Izuku's eyes drift downwards to where he feels like he's floating, but he knows his feet are flat on something. He can feel the angled, like he stood on solid ground, but they're not. He can't even see his feet. There is no ground. Takes probably too far along for him to notice the black misty, he's not sure what that is, crawling up his body. He thinks briefly on how unimpressed Shota would be with Izuku's situational awareness, or lack thereof. The misty, void-like stuff covers the bottom half of his body, but makes no move to climb any higher. He feels his hips and legs and feet below it, numb with a soft pins and needles kind of feeling that isn't uncomfortable. He has no desire to move, though. It's not constricting. It's almost calming in a way. Izuku blinks owlishly at the bottom half of his body. The darkness covering his lower half flickers off into a deep, verdant green towards the end of the void that holds onto him, outlining him from the rest of the void he's in. The texture where the green tapers off towards the surrounding blackness of where he is, as well as where it meets the void Izuku has stood in, appears almost staticky, pixelated, but different to that of the villain working with the League of Villains. He's not sure, but something about it is different. Which is why he's not scared. There's no fear. He's not afraid. It's familiar in a way, too, but not familiar in a bad way. I've been waiting to meet you. A voice drawls in Izuku's gaze. There's someone else in the void with him. A man, young but not young like Izuku or even his teachers or his ghost friend. He's middle-aged, but in no way senior. He looks worn down, pale hair and almost sickly complexion. He looks malnourished and fragile. He doesn't quite look real. Or alive, may be a better word for it. This, whoever it is, looks closer to Oboro than he is to Izuku. This person is a ghost. The longer Izuku stares, the more he thinks he's seen this man before, or... No, he hasn't seen him. He's seen his eyes. A fleeting memory of eyes watching him during the sports festival. Several pairs and all mites observing with a ghostly glow, surrounded by staticky black nothingness. If he's seeing him here, wherever here is, then... I'm dead? The teen whispers out. The thought and words drop into his stomach like a brick. He feels it, the anxiety of it. He'd never thought anxiety would carry over. No, the ghost shakes his head, lips twitching faintly into a smile that doesn't stick. You're still alive, Ninth. You gave it your best shot, though, I'll admit it. Ninth? Izuku breathes out, attention crawling up and down the ghost that stood out of arm's reach. Ninth wielder, the ghost corrects himself for Izuku's sake, cocking his head to watch the teenager. Of One for All. One for All, Izuku repeats quietly, breathily. You're one of them. I saw you. At the sports festival, you were there, behind All Might. Yes, the ghost replies shortly. You helped me, Izuku blinks. He almost wants to move to approach this ghost, but he doesn't. He stays in place and lets his limbs melt into the constant numbness. I didn't activate One for All that day. I couldn't. You did it. How did you... I am One for All, the ghost tilts his head. It was mine before anyone else, so it's embedded to me, just as I'm embedded to it. My control fluctuates, and I can't very well wield it from my place, especially when it's in someone else's possession, but at times, very rarely, I'm able to offer aid. That hypnosis quirk was powerful, but with your lack of control over your body, it gave me an opening. Who are you? Izuku sucks in a breath, eyes wide as he tracks the ghost's movements. The ghost doesn't really move, just shifts a little from foot to foot. Where are the other vestiges? There's 7 of you, aren't there? I saw 7 of you behind All Might that day. Who I am isn't important yet. The ghost, first Izuku will call him, shakes his head. There's much you must learn before I'm of any importance to you, and the others aren't of use to you now either. You don't understand One for All, nor do you understand your own quirk. Though you make good progress, you're not ready. I'm not? No. First sighs, the sound coming out like a huff, but almost fond. I'm afraid until you know your own quirk, you won't be able to fully learn what One for All is capable of. Not for you. How can I learn my own quirk? Izuku whispers, pleading to the ghost. He seems clever, that age-old kind of smart that you achieve from observing and retaining over the years. I'd start with learning what not to do, first suggests with a one-shouldered shrug. You're unconscious now. Why? Why? He remembers being cold. So cold. What had happened again? He'd gone to find Ida, sent out a distress map pin. Stain, the hero killer, was there, and Todoroki showed up. He got colder. Todoroki didn't hit him with his ice, though, just the pretense of it. Touching it, being close to it, it made him feel cold. He ignored it. Being cold wasn't a big deal. The more pressing matter was fighting Stain, saving Ida and Native, and making sure he and Todoroki walked out alive. Then he'd offered up control to Oboro to use his quirk. He'd been desperate, but the ghost had gone through. They'd both opened the connection like usual, but it hadn't worked. Why hadn't it worked? He remembers the strike of freezing shooting through his entire shoulder, the searing cold like he plunged his arm into a vat of ice water, or maybe even liquid nitrogen. Cold. Burning cold. I was cold. Izuku angles his chin downward, muttering, but it's not softening like it usually does. There's no need. He's in his head, isn't he? Or in the quirk. It burned, but Oboro didn't even touch me. He went through. It was just cold. How do you usually feel, ghosts? Cold? Izuku wrinkles his nose uncertainly. They're always cold when they get too close, like they're pockets of cold air, but when they touch you, I don't know, it's like being bit with a snowball that splatters against you and it melts through you, but cold melting instead of warm melting. All right, first furrows his eyebrows. And that half-fire, half-quirk ice fellow, what about him? Todoroki? Izuku hums thoughtfully. It couldn't have been him. I fought him during the festival. He used his ice first and nothing. This didn't happen then. I've never felt that before. And us? You? Izuku blinks in surprise. What about you? We're cold, First replies calmly. We're ghosts too. Vestiges, really, but same concept. One for All has all of our consciousness embedded in it, and mind, soul, who really knows? That's hardly different from your ghost friends in the living world. We're just internalized. I've never thought about that, Izuku hummed thoughtfully. I still don't know how I got so cold. What happened? I just got a little cold and it started to hurt a bit. Surely it can't be that bad, right? Ninth, first eases slowly, hesitant and cautious. You're hypothermic right now. You're unconscious because your body temperature dropped low enough that your organs started to fail. I am? Izuku swallows, suddenly feeling sick. But what happened during that fight that hasn't happened before? What was different? Good question. When he used his quirk with Oboro, Todoroki was never around. No one was. It was a secret. You don't use a secret quirk around other people. It defeats the purpose of keeping a secret. And when he'd fought Todoroki during the sports festival, Oboro had already been gone at that point. He's not sure where the ghost had left to after accidentally using Izuku's quirk, but he knows that Oboro had been quick to disappear, guilty and ashamed. The vestiges were always around. There was part of One for All, and One for All was now a part of Izuku, so they would have been there for everything. It's stacked, Izuku realizes with a frown. The cold, Todoroki's ice, Oboro's freezing touch, and you vestiges, all of your cold attributes stacked one after another until my body couldn't handle it. First gives him a slow nod, acknowledging that they've come to the same conclusion. We made ourselves prominent using your quirk, just differently than you do with the ghost outside of the quirk. First tells him, bowing his head almost apologetically. When you were making progress with One for All, we were praising you. Our presence and activity made your temperature drop like touching your ghost friend would. He remembers that. Voices in the back of his head that he didn't really know, but got the feeling that they were vestiges, prominent alongside his own thoughts. Now that he really thinks about it, that's when he started to feel the chill crawling along his skin. They're always there. He assumes if they're embedded in One for All, but they're not usually trying to be heard. They're dormant. He hadn't even known that they existed until they made their presence known. I apologize for that, Ninth. First shakes his head. We'll be more careful now that we know the repercussions of overusing your quirk. If we'd have known. It's all right, Izuku frowns. I didn't know either, and it's my quirk. You're not at fault, and Todoroki's not at fault, and Oboro isn't either. No one knew. First studies Izuku for a second before shaking his head fondly. You need to watch your quirk, Ninth. Your temperature is vital if you plan on exploring it. It very well could be deadly, and might have been today if your ice-fire friend hadn't lent you his warmth. I know, Izuku mumbles solemnly, almost feeling scolded despite the fact that he was literally not being scolded. First tone is careful yet serious. There's no guarantee that the cold won't stack again, even if I try to keep it from happening. A thoughtful pause as Izuku rubs at his chin with his thumb and index finger. Maybe I can get the support course to help make a heated cold resistance hero costume. It would need to be a lightweight and mobile one, but not sure how the heater aspect would play into it. I also know I can't rely solely on cold resistance either. Sorry. Izuku snaps his jaw shut when he realizes that he'd been mumbling. First seems interested, though, and waves him off with a stiff flap of his hand. I hope for your sake that those ideas can be made into reality. I have faith in you, Ninth. We all do, including the eighth wielder who chose you. Izuku's not sure why that feels as nice to hear as it does. He literally doesn't know this man past the fact that he's One for All's first user. Still, he tucks his chin against his chest as he gives a sheepish smile. He's never been good at accepting compliments. Izuku startles when he feels the numbness around his bottom half and legs waver, numbness flickering to flexing muscles like his limbs are waking up from numbness. I suppose your temperature's rising. First lips flicker up once again into a light smile. Wait, Izuku gasps. Will I see you again? You guys have been dormant since I got the quirk, but since the sports festival, I've felt you. We should lie low until you figure out your quirk, First explains softly as Izuku winces as his toes flex and pins and needles start to get more intense. When we're dormant, we're not trouble for you. But we'll be here when you're ready, First promises easily. Hopefully by then you'll have your support gear ready. A pause. Izuku's brain feels numb as he blinks slowly, forcing his eyes open. But now, First, the black void is crawling up the older man's body. It's mixed with a lighter, paler green compared to Izuku's. The void doesn't stop at his hips like it had on Izuku. It continues up until First's face is in view, the void reaching up his neck slowly. Good luck, Ninth. I'll see you again. By some holy power, all 3 of his students ended up in the same room in the pediatric ward of the hospital. Shota was happy about that, since now he didn't have to make his rounds between rooms to check in on the students. He couldn't find a chair and watch all of them at once. Unless they were in the same room. Bless the Lord. It's not long after he's finished texting with Hizashi that a nurse stops in front of him and informs him that the students have all been treated. He stands, his joints cracking and unhappy as he moves to follow to their room. He'll admit, he's a bit surprised to find his kids have been settled into a room in the children's ward. He'd thought they would have been placed in the hero section of the hospital, but he's not about to complain about it. That would be illogical and futile, and all that matters is they're being treated. He knows why they were put in the pediatrics ward, despite the fact that they're clearly hero students. The hero ward, normally where heroes, heroic students included, would be treated, was packed with those licensed heroes that were injured during the Nomu attacks. It was a bit surprising how many heroes had been injured or bedridden due to the League and the Nomus, but Shota couldn't judge, considering a Nomu had almost killed him as well. He doesn't know the full story yet, or what exactly had gone down in Hosu outside of Stain. And to be fair there, he doesn't know the full story about Stain yet either. But he's sure he'll hear about it. Shota honestly didn't care where the hospital put his students, as long as they were receiving treatment. Todoroki and Tenya, however, seemed a little miffed at the idea they were put in the children's ward. It was almost like they'd forgotten they were 15, and that it was legally still a child's age. Shota is now seated, pushed up against a wall. There are 4 beds in the room, all pressed close to a corner of the room, Tenya and Izuku on one side, and Todoroki across from Tenya on the other. He'd pushed his chair so he was between Izuku and Tenya, but still able to keep an eye on Todoroki as well. The 2 teens that are awake have been mended up, in the old-fashioned way, because healing quirks the hospital had employed were being spread around and used on more substantial and life-threatening injuries. His students just needed stitches and bandages for the most part, well, except for Izuku. Shota turns his head to the side where Izuku's still unconscious. He'd been diagnosed with severe hypothermia, but the cause was a mystery. The teen was wrapped in 3 warm cotton blankets and hooked up to IV drips, administering warm fluids in an attempt to raise his core temperature. Knowing that Izuku almost died, of overexposure to a cold that he couldn't place, no less, was probably one of the scariest things that Shota had ever thought about. His heart had been beating so slow, struggling to keep going. His breathing slow and shallow, his temperature had dropped significantly and settled at 81 degrees Fahrenheit when he'd arrived at the hospital, and that was with Todoroki's left side keeping him warm. If Todoroki hadn't been there, then Shota doesn't even want to think about it. Izuku hadn't stirred at all since Shota sat down in the room, and he'd been sitting with them for roughly 20 minutes now. He'd be worried about the green-haired boy if it weren't for the steady heartbeat, and the now dark-haired man could see his kid's chest rising and falling with breaths. As of now, Todoroki and Ida hadn't said much, and Shota assumes that's because of his presence, but he'll be damned if he leaves them. Not until they're discharged and taken away by guardians. Shota himself has his legs kicked out in front of him, leaning back heavily in his chair. He has half a mind to sprawl across the floor or the 4th unused bed, but desperately wants to be awake when Izuku comes to. Shota does let his eyes slip shut for a couple moments of rest, but it's short-lived. His eyes snap open when the door is violently yet quietly torn open. Hizashi has stood in the doorway, eyes instantly locked on Shota. He signs Sunshine, the nickname that he'd dubbed Izuku with, twice frantically in succession before his gaze drops on the green-haired boy. Shota just blinks as his husband rushes to the bed from the door. Barely pausing to close it behind himself, he perches delicately on the edge of Izuku's bed, taking care not to jostle him. He looks like Izuku's relaxed, sleeping face over, and it takes a few long seconds before slowly reaching out to touch his cheek with the backs of his fingers. He strokes Izuku's hair back, hand pausing on the teen's forehead like he's feeling for a fever, before he's petting his hair back again, nimble fingers carding through green locks. He's intently focused on their foster son, hardly aware of the room or the people around him. Shota stares for a second longer at Hizashi, who has yet to notice the other teens in the room, before he's glancing at Tenya and Todoroki to gauge their reactions. Tenya looks surprised, watching Hizashi uncertainly. He knows that Hizashi, but he's probably confused on why Hizashi's there, let alone fawning over Izuku. Todoroki, on the other hand, just looks confused. His eyebrows are knitted together as he watches. Shota doubts his student even knows that that's his English teacher carding his fingers through the classmate's hair. "Sensei." Tenya's meek voice catches Shota's attention. He lulls his head to his student's direction, frowning when he notices Tenya's eyes flickering between himself and Hizashi. Shota notices that Hisashi doesn't look towards him at the question, doesn't flinch like he heard it. He responds to Tenya's voice. Shota angles his head and nearly sighs when he notes the lack of hearing aids, of course. What? Why is, Tenya looks towards Todoroki, who's listening intently, dual-colored eyes, now on his class rep instead of Izuku and Hisashi. What is Hisashi doing here? He's Izuku's guardian, Shota explains blandly. Tenya jolts up in surprise, mouth agape as he stares, first at Hisashi and Izuku and then at Shota. The underground hero can already hear the question, "You're Midoriya's guardian?" Because, of course, if Hisashi is, Shota would be too, since they're married. What's yours is mine and all that marriage crap, right? Izuku? Todoroki asks from across the room, one eyebrow arching in surprise. Ah, shit. He'd almost forgotten that Todoroki was here, too. Todoroki looks back at Hisashi and Izuku, eyes narrowed and nose scrunching up. Hisashi, as if feeling eyes on him, turns. He catches Todoroki's eyes and Shota sees his husband stiffen, his eyes no doubt going wide as he places his student. The shock doesn't leave, but it does jump to Tenya, where it multiplies before dread pulls in his features and he moves quickly to the other teen. Tenya ducks his head in shame, cheeks heating up when Hisashi forces his gaze back up by 2 fingers under his chin, studying his face for injuries. Tenya relents, allowing Hisashi to angle his face as he pleases. The kid's used to Hisashi's touchy nature, after all. When Hisashi finally turns back to Shota, the man arches an eyebrow before signing, "Hearing aids?" Hisashi shrugs sheepishly. Dead. He pulls the hearing aids and the charger out of his pocket, passing them to Shota. That's about right. He would have worn them at the studio, and Shota knows better than anyone how bad Hisashi is at remembering to charge them. He bets the hearing aids had made the low battery noise before he'd left, so Hisashi pocketed their charger before they died in the car. Shota shakes his head, setting the charging hearing aids in his own pocket. Hisashi's now back at Izuku's side, not touching him, but sitting beside him again. The blonde taps the railing of Izuku's bed to get his attention. What happened? Stain, Shota replies after a moment of thought. Hisashi's eyes furrow as his nose wrinkles, and he follows the motions intently before he's shaking his head, lifting his hands in an I don't know gesture. Shota huffs, thinks for a second before adding, "Hero killer." Hisashi gasps audibly at that, jolting up to look at the students again, as if they hadn't just passed his once-overs. He gapes, looking between Todoroki and Ida before looking back at Izuku and pointing to him. It's a silent question of, what about Izuku, but Shota knows it's a conversation for when his husband can hear. He shakes his head, signing a quick later, and though Hisashi pouts when his gaze lifts from Shota's hands to his stern face, he doesn't push. Tenya clears his throat, eyes still on Hisashi, though Hisashi isn't looking at him. Tenya knows a little bit of sign, less than Tensei, who is fluent enough to be able to hold a conversation, but Shota doesn't think he understands what's been said. Are we in trouble? Yes. Shota doesn't bother sugarcoating. Tenya wilts and Todoroki frowns slightly. I don't know what happened, but I know that none of you were where you're supposed to be. When I arrived, neither of your mentors were with you two. You were supposed to shadow them, not run off on your own. What were you doing there, Sensei? Todoroki asked slowly. How'd you find us? I assume we all got a text from Midoriya, he huffs. Tenya cocks an eyebrow like that's news to him, but Todoroki narrows his eyes at Shota thoughtfully. Midoriya texts you? Shit. What text? Tenya frowns. Todoroki turns to look at him, head cocked like a puppy. The location pin he sent out. I assume... Dual-colored eyes jerk suspiciously to Shota before looking back at Tenya. That everyone in Midoriya's contacts received the same pin. So you didn't go to help Midoriya? Shota drawls slowly, watching his friend's little brother intently. How'd you join their merry band of misfits, then? Tenya shifts awkwardly, guiltily, before sighing. Midoriya came to rescue me. Excuse me? Shota's back stiffens as he sits up a little. What the hell does that mean, Tenya? It was my fault, Sensei. Ida bows his head. I left my mentor, and I found the hero killer, and if it wasn't for Midoriya, I would be... Ida swallows heavily, looking away. I forgot who I was there, what I was, but my peers helped me see how foolish I was for seeking revenge from my brother. It wasn't heroic. It was selfish. I apologize for the trouble I caused. Shota stares as the information sinks in. Tenya had been the ringleader here. Out of character. He can see it, though. The teen had been torn to pieces at the information that Tensei may never walk again, let alone be in Genium ever again. Still, It was foolish and dangerous, and Shota and Hisashi lecture him. Shota will make sure that Tenya's mother and older brother are both aware of what he'd done, and that he receives lectures from them as well. Tenya should have known better. He knows how dangerous Stain was, had seen the damage he can cause with his own 2 eyes, and then he'd still thought that he was tough enough to go after him. "You've called both of my classmates by their given names." Todoroki draws Shota's attention in. The man's already tired of this conversation, but he can see the cogs turning in Todoroki's head. He opens his mouth, but Tenya beats him to it. "Sensei went to school with my brother," Tenya explains. "He knew me when I was little. He's like an uncle." "Oh," Todoroki frowns. "What about Midoriya?" I don't see how that's any of your business," Shota snaps, but it holds no heat to it. He's too tired for any heat. He just wants to sleep at this point. "Midoriya's personal matters are none of your concerns. Respect his privacy." "Yes, Sensei." Todoroki bows his head, but still looks suspicious. "Of course, Aizawa-sensei." Tenya nods seriously. "It's wrong of us to pry into a classmate's personal life." "That's the spirit, kid," Shota encourages blandly. He leans back in the chair, spine curving again as he hunches down. He's so tired. Neither teen says anything more. They've already dug themselves into a hole. Anything they add will be digging themselves deeper, and Hisashi is back in his own little world, staring down at Izuku and thumbing across his cheek. Shota lets his eyes close again, arms crossing over his chest and tucking into his capture weapon for warmth. A while passes, an hour, maybe 2. He doesn't let himself fall asleep, but beside him, Tenya has drifted off. Shota listens to the sound of evened-out breathing from either side of him, keeping his eyes closed in feigned sleep. He stays like that until he hears Izuku stir. Hisashi is off the back when the kid moves as he wakes, and Shota stands to glance down. Izuku's eyes open slowly, slivered, and fluttering at the overhead lights. "Problem child." Shota finally lets his hand settle on the teen's forehead, pushing his hair back like Hisashi had been. The curls are soft under his fingertips, and his forehead is pleasantly warm. "How are you feeling?" "Cold still, a bit stiff, and do I have stitches?" Izuku rasps, wrangling a hand from under the blankets to rub at his eyes. He looks towards Hisashi, who smiles softly, then to Shota, who cocks an eyebrow before he becomes a tad bit more alert. "What are you guys doing here?" "They tend to call you when your kid almost dies," Shota snarks, harsh words bombed over by the way that his fingers carefully card through Izuku's hair. Izuku leans into the touch, eyes slipping closed for a second. "You do have stitches. Quite a few, actually." "Sorry," Izuku winces lightly, shifting in the bed. "Didn't mean to." "Problem children like you never do," Shota sighs heavily. Even with the heavy sigh, he feels incredibly light now that Izuku's awake and coherent. "You should rest up, kid. We can talk more when you're all warmed up and Hisashi's got his ears back." Izuku frowns, turning to Hisashi. The man had been attempting to lip read. Hisashi cocks his head when Izuku looks over. The green-haired teen sheepishly waves in greeting. Hisashi lets out a quiet laugh as he returns the gesture before his hand is dropping, settling softly over the teens. They sit with their kid for a while, one of them on either side of the bed. Hisashi strokes Izuku's hair back, and the kid pushes back into it eagerly. Shota rests his back against the headboard, and Izuku tucks into his side, just a little, and using his arm as a makeshift pillow. He doesn't seem entirely awake, but he's talking and warming up, and that's all that matters. Neither teacher or the green-haired boy notice the half-hot, half-cold teenager watching them, apprehensively like they're a puzzle to be solved. It's a while later that a knock sounds on the door, and a man with a mutated dog quirk is easing the door open, looking surprised to see the 2 men on either side of Izuku. The 2 share a look, before glancing around at all their students. "We'll be back in a bit," Shota offers the 2 boys, still awake. He passes Hisashi his hearing aids, and the man slips them into his ears. "Hey, listener," Hisashi finally greets softly. "Be right back, you dig?" Izuku nods slowly, eyes darting between the 2 men and the man at the door. The 2 teachers slip out behind the man, and Izuku slumps back into his bed, eyes closing. They snap open when he hears his classmates' casual voice, and following that he sits ramrod straight when the words register. "I thought you were All Might's secret love child," Todoroki hums thoughtfully, not even looking at Izuku as he sputters, in surprise. Todoroki had thought that? What the hell? "I was wrong. You're obviously Aizawa-sensei's secret love child." Todoroki? He's not— I'm not— No, I'm not! Izuku cries out in shock. I'm not anyone's secret love child. You are definitely Aizawa-sensei's love child, Todoroki nods to himself. And that man was Present Mike. I thought Sensei was married to Midnight. Also wrong. He's married to Mike Sensei. Midnight? Todoroki, why? All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 21 of Yuuei Survival Guide. Chapter 22 will be next. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.